We called the Corsair 500D boring and safe in some of our post-CES coverage, remarking that it had all the cleaned up marks of a modern case, but took no risks. With the case now launched, it's time to see whether that opinion stands the test of a build, and the Corsair 500D is a $150 enclosure that repurposes parts of the 570X tooling, but introduces new paneling and styling to the enclosure. A $250 glass variation of this case will ship once front panel yield issues are resolved, and other than some RGB LEDs and glass and fans, it will use the same tooling and largely be the same enclosure. But today, we're focusing on the Corsair 500D version that we have for thermals, noise, and build quality. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. As usual, let's go over the whole case before getting into the build notes and thermals and noise discussion. First of all, it's obviously something of an artistically styled case. They have the top panel that's got slight raises on the sides and comes down in the middle, and it only has ventilation in the center, which is not ideal for thermals, but it looks kind of cool, and that's what they're going for. The front panel is aluminum on this version. There will be a glass version later for a lot more money, but they also, I think, include more fans that are going to be RGB, which further increases the cost. And for the doors, this is probably the best feature, really. These partly come off of the Project Slate case from Computex that was really more of a halo effect than anything. So these doors are tinted tempered glass, and they are able to look curved without actually being curved. So Corsair does get credit for that. Corsair's basically glued on this aluminum front that's curved that way towards the front panel, and in doing so, they've saved themselves the trouble of glass yield issues where bending a glass panel increases your cost a lot because you have to throw away a lot of them or recycle them or whatever. So they've resolved the issue of curved glass yield for the front, or for the sides rather, and they've still managed to make it look like it's curved. So they get credit there. The panels are pretty easy to remove vertically. There's a screw in the top right now to hold them in place. You remove the screw, you pop it up, panel comes off. Internally, the case is really pretty simple overall, and that's part of the thing with this case, is that it doesn't really take any risk. It's kind of boring. That's not necessarily bad, but taking risks is always interesting for new products. This panel doesn't fully grip. So this is something they've done well and also not. The panel attaches via magnet to the case, which is pretty cool, but also this magnet doesn't align perfectly in the bottom corner, whereas if I tug at this one, you'll see it doesn't move until I apply enough force to actually open the thing, whereas this one flexes a bit, and the same is true for the opposite side, the top left. So the magnets don't align perfectly on our samples. Maybe that's just a sampling thing. But either way, let's get rid of the panel. I've taken the screw out, so that comes out pretty easily. And inside the case, which is quite heavy with all the stuff in it, pretty expected layout for the last year now. There's a vertical GPU mount, which you absolutely should not use with an open face cooled card. It's probably fine with a reference sized open loop card, but not open face air. So there's a vertical GPU mount there. There's a weird power supply shroud that feels more like ticking a box than providing something, because the thing with this is you can easily have a power supply that comes out to here, and there's very little space left for your cables at that point. So you're going to be removing this front of it, which is removable, so that's good. However, if you're doing that, you really might as well just get rid of the whole thing, since it kind of interferes with lower PCIe slot utilization anyway, and we've typically found that power supply shrouds do impact GPU thermals if you have especially fans in the lower position of the case. Not a big deal though. It just seems like the power supply shroud is more of a ticking a box than anything. So because of how empty the rest of the enclosure is, and because this doesn't go all the way across, it doesn't really feel like it should be there. But that's more subjective than anything. Objectively, what I can show you is that the front can fit 3 120mm fans. We currently have a weird configuration in there for testing. The top can fit 2 140s. The back has a 120 in it presently that can be adjusted vertically if you needed to. And a feature that we like with the case is the fan cages for the top and for the front, which remove with 2 thumb screws just like that. And then you can pull it out, and we've got the fan cables on there now. But the idea is that you can really easily get the fans onto a separate sheet of metal, and then attach that to the case, just like that, obviously. No, not really, don't do that. But you attach it like that. So the reason they've done that is because the front panel is more or less not removable. So to get this panel off, it's 2 screws underneath, 1 screw inside that's not particularly accessible with the power supply shroud, and then 2 tiny screws up here. They've put a lot of effort into making it difficult to take that front panel off. You can do it, and we did do it for testing, but the point stands that because there's no real reason to take the front panel off, there needed to be a good way to mount the fans to the front of the case. So they thought that through, and we give them credit for that, because otherwise you'd have to take out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screws to get fans in and out of the case. So this is good. They've done a good job with this. One other cool thing that we did like was the filter installation. So the filters are attached by magnet. They slide out of the side of the case. This is something that we've been hitting case manufacturers over the head with for a few years now. Sliding out of the back of the case is kind of dumb. I think they actually still do that with the power supply shroud. To the credit of the manufacturers, there's not a lot of other places you can put this thing, but if it's coming out of the back of the case, you can safely assume most cases are against a wall. And now you're moving your case to get the dust filter out. There are better ways to do that, but perhaps not with the way the feet are positioned on this one, or whatever. Or doing a lawn filter that goes all the way to the front of the case, pulling out the front. But either way, this one's good. This is in the front, and it means that because there's no real reason to remove the front panel, you can still pop it out to clean the filter. The top's the same way. It's a little bit harder to remove, but you basically just push on it from one side, and then you pull it out, and there's your top filter. So they've done well with that. Speaking of the top panel, however, it's very strange. So it's got this artistic arc to it. If you like it, cool. That's not really up to me to decide. They have a weird tessellated pattern in the top. I'm sure you could do the math and show how much more efficient holes would be instead. Whatever. That's clearly not the intention of the top panel. What is a bit stranger, though, is that because the way this is positioned, you can tell that this panel was somewhat designed around the 570X, because if you look at the 570X, the glass is boosted up, and that's glass. It's a clean sheet of glass on the top. So they've kind of had to design around those parameters, and for whatever reason, it comes down lower in the middle and it only has holes in the middle. So if you're planning to put a radiator in the top, you're seriously restricting the airflow of that radiator. I mean, obviously I would much prefer to see this boosted higher or changed completely, because it's a strange setup for a radiator. It's not going to work that well. But we can talk about thermals for the rest of the case as well for the setup. So the stock setup, one 120mm fan, front and center, right in the middle here. It's splitting its airflow between the GPU and the CPU. That has traditionally never worked very well. However, they have fan slots for more fans. You're probably buying this with an extra fan if you go by our recommendation, or if you're going with liquid coolers anyway. The downside is that it's $150 and you're buying an extra fan. That kind of sucks. It's got one 120 in the rear, which is fine. Both the fans are acceptable. They're not the worst fans we've worked with in cases, and there are some really bad ones, but they're decent. It's just we wish there was another one, or if there were another one, then we'd really be getting close to the 570X configuration, in which case you're kind of wondering, why does this exist? But the answer is primarily because it does actually slightly boost the height of the case so that it can accommodate fatter radiators, and it also changes the design completely. So there is a reason for this case to exist. The tooling is familiar. That's fine. It's pretty normal for tooling to get reused. That's how you profit, as long as there are significant changes elsewhere, and clearly there are. For the front panel actually does have significant spacing here. We have more than what we typically recommend for spacing. Once you close the glass, though, it does chew through some of the extra space in the side of the front panel. But as we'll show in testing, the panel's not nearly as bad as a lot of the others we've seen in the past year. It's still not great, but because it's full top to bottom openness, not even a mesh, it's just completely open about an inch or so, there's enough room for the fans to breathe reasonably. You know, again, it's not like a Redline 06, but it's okay. Going through some of Patrick's notes here for the build and appearance section of the review, which he has written in the article linked in the description below, Patrick notes that the chassis of the 500D is only a slightly modified version of the 570X, the case that we gave a quality build award back in 2016, but that doesn't give this one a free pass. The exterior panels are often what make or break the performance of a case anyway. We'll discuss that in the thermal section. As for looks, Corsair has successfully adapted old tooling to a new model without obvious compromises, other than some cutouts around the edges that were clearly intended for steel side panels on the left side of the case, but those aren't visible with the case closed. The side panels are completely identical and more or less interchangeable, which probably benefits Corsair as much as it does consumers. At the front, there are rubber-wrapped magnets that clamp firmly onto the case. When they work well, but the manufacturing tolerances are very fine, and not all of the magnets on our case made strong enough contact with the case metal. That said, once it's closed, as long as you're not moving it around, they're fine. They close securely enough when stationary. The side panels complement the curved front panel, which is brushed aluminum on the version we're reviewing here, but is made of tempered glass in the upcoming special edition, presumably contributing to a much higher cost. There are intentional gaps all around the side panels, but especially at the front, where there's about a centimeter of empty space on either side of the front panel for airflow. It's no mesh front, but it's better than some we've seen. Behind the motherboard tray, the cable management channel has some excellent cable tie points with Velcro straps pre-attached, something we've always liked, and there's also a gutter-shaped piece of steel designed to clamp over and contain all of the cables. It's a good idea, but it's a tight fit for everything to get in there, and once it's installed, every cable must go through this channel in order to get the cutouts usable. We use the bare minimum of cables in our test bench, but if we added any more, they probably wouldn't fit. We'd have to remove the cable management bar to better fit, because otherwise it's blocking off the channeling. This is all necessary because the side panels are both transparent, so messy cables would be fully visible, and because the side panel is just held on with magnets and doesn't really have the force to squash down the wad of cables, there is extra need to manage everything cleanly. Getting into the thermal section, 2 fans is pretty underwhelming for a $150 case. The non-LED Corsair SP120s look and feel decent, but we've tested many cases by now with 1 intake and 1 exhaust configurations, and they've never done especially well. For additional tests, we did the usual: no front panel, a vertical GPU, and an additional Noctua NF A14 fan added to the front top of the case. Vertical GPU mounting was difficult, as frequently is the case with this configuration, because we've got a tower cooler for the CPU and an extra wide GTX 1080. Sometimes there's space, but Corsair's vertical PCIe slots were too high for the card to fit properly this time, and we took a zip tie approach just for thermal testing. We obviously wouldn't recommend it for normal use. This would be better suited to a reference-sized card and, as we've stated constantly, for open-loop configurations. We can still test it thermally though. Taking the front panel off was also one of our tests. It's not the easiest thing to do, but it's okay on this case. For the additional fan test, we chose to move the stock fan to the top slot in the front and put the Noctua fan in the middle, simply because that was the easiest layout to use for the mounting holes. Looking at a chart first, only with the 500D, before getting to the comparative data, CPU temperature in our torture test averaged 56.7 degrees Celsius over ambient. Removing the front panel lowered this thanks to the less obstructed airflow, but only by 5.6 degrees to 51.1 degrees. We've seen much more dramatic shifts with the front panel removals before, indicating that there is reasonable airflow through the side venting on this case, but also that there's limited intake anyway, given that we're based on 1 fan. The top panel is ventilated, so it's possible that the CPU cooler could be drawing some cool air through it, even without the front panel removed. Adding an extra 140mm fan brought CPU temperature down to 51.7 degrees within margin of error of the panel-less test. Vertically mounting the GPU resulted in a lower than stock 53.6 degrees Celsius CPU temperature, but we've seen this behavior multiple times in the past. Airflow patterns change, and the GPU isn't able to dump heat as efficiently, which overall means that there's less warm air next to and below the CPU cooler. The radiative heat off the backplate of the GPU is also now more distant from the CPU cooler, thus reducing the CPU temperature. Comparatively, for CPU torture thermals, 56.7 degrees can't quite compete with the 570X's 50.2 degrees, but adding the 140mm fan almost gets it there. The 570X has 3 intake fans, but no exhaust, and exhaust fans do benefit our CPU cooler a good deal. With the stock configuration, CPU temperature is average to below average, around the level of the KL07 or even the H500P, and thus far there's really nothing spectacular about the cooling performance of this case. Baseline GPU torture temperature averaged 57.3 degrees Celsius. Taking off the front panel lowered this to 52.8 degrees, which again isn't that drastic a reduction compared to something like the H500P or some other case that more seriously restricts airflow. Mounting the GPU vertically raised it to 63.2 degrees, surprising nobody. This was also after accounting for throttling, so our frequencies were lower and our temperature was still higher. Vertical mounting next to a side panel is never good for GPU air coolers, and that goes double for this case. There, of course, are instances where it's okay, but those would require spacing between the panel and the GPU, not something present in this particular enclosure. Adding the knock to a fan raised the GPU temperature to 60.7 degrees, which we found attributable to the change in airflow patterns by relocating the higher pressure 120mm fan to the top and installing the knock to a fan more centered on the GPU, thus pushing more air over the backplate than previously rather than straight into the face of the card. So these numbers do in fact make sense despite the fact that it's slightly higher. It's because we changed which fan was where. Comparatively, GPU temperature isn't good. There are cases on the chart with absolutely awful thermals that averaged more than 60 degrees, but at 57.3 degrees, the 500D is still in the company of the PureBase 600 and the Inwin 805i, both of which we criticized for poor cooling. The best way to improve this with an air-cooled GPU would be to add a fan at the bottom of the front panel rather than the top, or just fill all 3 fan slots, at which point you've created a 570X. And that posted a GPU temperature of 51.3 degrees. This is practically on the opposite end of the chart at this point, and shows that the 570X, which this one is based off of, was still a reasonable case, and it's really not that different in price either. The looks are quite different though. Like the Meshify, you'd have to add more fans to make this case better. The Firestrike Extreme test got GPU temperature to about 60.6 degrees Celsius. Because our 3D Mark chart is smaller and doesn't include the always awful vertical GPU numbers, that means the 500D is tied for worst score with the Antec P8. Impressive. One fan splitting airflow above and below the GPU backplate never works especially well, and at least one additional intake fan, correctly positioned, is a good idea for the 500D. CPU rendering with Blender resulted in a CPU temperature of 38.1 degrees Celsius over ambient. That's right in the middle of the chart between the H700i and the C700P. The 2 stock fans are positioned with a bias toward cooling the CPU, so although there isn't much airflow through the whole case, CPU temperatures are acceptable in all of these tests. Rendering on the GPU, the 500D did better comparatively than it did in the Firestrike test. 30.5 degrees over ambient is still on the warm end of the chart, but it's just about equal to the stock Meshify C and definitely cooler than the Antec P8 and Corsair Spec 04. The Blender test doesn't push the GPU to its complete limits and doesn't strain the CPU like our gaming stand-in 3D Mark does, so it provides an example of temperatures to be expected with a normal production workload as opposed to a gaming workload. Moving on to noise now, the relatively small fan diameter and the front panel air gaps that are pointed directly towards the user make the 500D a bit louder than it could be, but there are still only 2 fans and they don't make as much noise as something like the 570X. 37.4 dBA isn't, again, as loud as the 570X was with 3 front intake fans at full speed, and instead falls closer to the 270R and the Spec 04, both from Corsair, which respectively had 2 and 1 120mm stock fans. Case manufacturers have to balance quality and quantity of stock fans with the final price of the product. The best case scenario for enthusiasts is a case that includes a small number of high-quality fans so that the stock fans don't need to be replaced and the user can shop for their own additional fans. That's only good if it's reflected in the price, though. The 500D is $30 less than the 570X, which has more or less the same chassis and an additional fan in a setup that's more beneficial to cooling for our particular case that we're testing today, or our configuration anyway. So the 500D would probably look better in value without the reference point of Corsair's own 570X, but the looks are very different. If you like all glass, the 570X obviously is a winner over this one. If you don't like that look, well, there's plenty of other options. So speaking of other options, there are a lot of good cases at $150. This one, although not really impressive, isn't offensive either. It's just, it doesn't do anything really other than change the looks of things. There's nothing new about the case. They have a lot of good ideas that have been applied to the case, but they're not new ideas. There are also some kind of weird or nearly bad ideas that we've already gone through in the thermal section. So it's okay. It's just in the middle of everything, and there are a lot of good cases at that price. So to go over some of them, this case is competing with things like the Be Quiet Dark Base 700, the high airflow SilverStone cases like the PM01 that we liked a lot, or the PM02 that we didn't like as much. And these examples are less than $150, all of them. And they're all pretty good cases that we've liked, but they're in the same ballpark. The 500D looks nice and performs okay, but for its price, we'd expect something just better, like something to make it more desirable or to stand out more than its competition. The special edition of this case, which will be like $100 more or somewhere around there, will provide that something specific to stand out for people, and that will be done with its curved tempered glass and apparently some extra fans that I think are going to be RGB. Again though, that's $250. So now you're competing with things like the Dark Base Pro 900, the weird cases like the Cougar Conqueror. You're getting into kind of artisan territory or very near it. So Corsair's positioned in a fiercely competitive market right now. The $100+ case market has not been this competitive in years, and for that, this case is going to have a hard time fighting. Again, it's not bad, just in terms of build quality, it's quite good. They've definitely gotten that down for the most part. We only really had one build quality defect, and that was the panel not quite closing, which is minor. You're not going to be picking the thing up and moving it a lot. So quality-wise, it's fine. They've done some really cool stuff we like the detachable fan panel. It's just that thermally, you basically should buy better fans, or more fans at least, to go with it. And even if they're more SP120s, because they're fine if you had more of them, or run a liquid cooler or something like that that comes with fans, which is probably what they're gearing towards, but the price should at least reflect it. I think their price is high because it's got aluminum brushed panels and a lot of tempered glass. So, you know, you're paying for looks. And if that's what you want, it's okay. But that's more or less what this case boils down to. It doesn't excite us. It doesn't offend us. There are certainly cases that have done both of those things in the last year. This isn't one of them. Not a bad place to fall in the stack, considering the extremes of the offending us category. So they haven't gone to that extreme, which is, I suppose, an upside. But that's all for this one. If you want to read more of Patrick's thoughts on this case, including more information on the build process, read his article linked in the description below. It'll contain some of the stuff I've already said. And subscribe for more. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our graph logo shirts, which I think I'm wearing, and the store.gamersnexus.net/modmat to pre-order or back order one of our next round of mod mats. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time. Vertically, there's a screw in the top right now to hold them in place. You remove the screw, you pop it up, panel comes off.